Hey, welcome to Craft Notes. You might remember that I've designed this course for you to experience what it's like to be a writer. Toward that end, I want to show you one of the most important strategies that working writers use to help themselves. They're called model texts, which are sometimes also called mentor texts. If you don't know what these terms mean, don't worry, because in this talk you will learn what model texts are, why you should use them, and how and when to use them. In terms of structure, first I'll show you some ways that I've used model text in my own writing practice. And then at the very end, you'll get to do some thinking about how you might use model text in your practice. So let's start with a working definition. What is a model text? A model text is a strong example of the kind of piece you're trying to write. Maybe it's a model of the structure or the tone or the conventions of a genre or something else. The point is, it's doing something that you want your piece to do. Why use a model text? Because it's a great way to learn. As I always tell my students, when you steal someone's words, that's called plagiarism. But when you steal someone's techniques, that's called learning. How and when to use model texts. I find that they're most useful when you're actively trying to figure something out. Let's say you're working on a story and you want to incorporate indirect dialogue, but you've never done it before, or you're struggling to learn how to do it. You might go to a story that features indirect dialogue in a strong way and break down how the writer is doing it, what techniques are at play there, and then steal those techniques for use in your own story. So basically, my recommendation is to take your "how do I do X" questions to a model text. I use model text a lot in my own practice. For my most recent novel, Do Not Go On, I used a couple of different model texts. I used Citizen Vince for tone and Winter's Bone for structure. So let's take a look at how I used each of those. I know there's a lot going on this page. I don't expect you to read it all. I just wanted to give you an overview, a broad overview of how I broke down Winter's Bone to figure out how its structure was working so that I could build a similar structure in my novel. What I did was read Winter's Bone really closely, and I broke down each chapter to figure out what's happening in the chapter, what's the source of conflict, what's the desire or yearning that is really fueling the chapter, and some other notes. What I found was that it mapped really neatly to a 5-act screenplay structure. Once I figured that out, I was able to use that as a structure for my novel. But if I hadn't gone through this process and broken it all down, I wouldn't have been able to figure that out, much less use it for myself. Citizen Vince, like I said, I wanted to mirror its tone. To figure out how to capture that tone, I retyped the whole novel. That sounds like a lot, but really I just used it as kind of a warm-up exercise. Every time I sat down to write in the morning, I would type out 2 or 3 pages of Citizen Vince, just as a way of warming up and kind of getting into writing. Retyping someone's work helps you inhabit it in a slightly different way than just reading it, even reading it closely. It's almost like you're sliding behind the wheel and you can kind of feel the moves that each sentence is making and each scene is making in a more intimate way than just reading it. So these are 2 ways to use mentor texts, but you can also just read them and think about how to do these things with your questions in mind. One last note. All of the stuff that I'm teaching you here is transferable. it doesn't just apply to fiction writing. I'm talking about fiction writing because that's mainly my practice, but use of model text can be helpful for anything from papers for your history class to stuff that you'll write for your future job or your future life. Okay, let's shift our focus now to you and your own work. Next, what I'm going to have you do is go to Canvas and answer some questions that will help you apply what you've learned here to your own work to see how you might most profitably use model text. Thanks for listening. Hope this was helpful.